In his controversial new book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, columnist Christopher Caldwell takes on the issue of Muslim immigration to the West and argues that Islam is fundamentally challenging the European way of life. In the middle of the 20th century, there were almost no Muslims in Europe. Today, there are as many as 17 million, making up about half of all newcomers there. And Caldwell argues these immigrants are not integrating, but in fact supplanting European culture and exhibiting attitudes consistent with a people, quote, patiently conquering Europe's cities street by street. I recently spoke with Christopher Caldwell and asked him what he meant by that.
The point of my book is not so much about conquest as it is about a Muslim population in Europe that is growing without ever really becoming part of Europe.
It's not assimilating, in other words.
Not really, no, not like here.
And why not?
I think that there's an economic explanation for it. Europe has a much more generous welfare state than we do. And a lot of our assimilation, I think, happens in the workplace.
Right.
And our first generation immigrants are all in the workplace. So they're all rubbing shoulders.
So at the lower levels of economic opportunity in Europe, it's just not there, in part because of the welfare state.
Well, yes, and their asylum policies, which are a big sticking point in Europe over the last 10 years, mean that in some countries, immigrants are not allowed to work. So there are, so you have.
And by asylum, you mean people who are, it's essentially political asylum from
refugees. You had them from Somalia and Bosnia in the early 90s. You had them from Iraq.
And they're not allowed to work. Amazing.
They're not allowed to work. And the result is, you'll never hear, even Americans who don't like immigration will never accuse immigrants of not being hardworking. Right. But you have a situation where in Swedish housing projects, you have, almost half the residents in these segregated housing projects are on welfare, first generation. You have the same thing in Amsterdam. And it begins to subsidize a very different form of life. So, for instance, 2/3 of the imams in France are on welfare.
Wow.
That's
wow.
part of the story. Yeah.
But in the other part is a cultural component. You seem to argue, for example, that it's not just the vigorous self-confidence of Islamic culture that is a problem here, but it's also the weakness of Western culture, the lack of self-confidence by European liberals.
I think that's right. And here's an area where I think my book differs a great deal from other treatments of this. I mean, my book tries to be comprehensive. It tries to cover everything from, religion to economics to terrorism to philosophy, etc. I think I differ from other writers on this in I have a generally positive view of the role of Islam, the religion, in these communities. And I think one of the things that's happening in Europe is that there's no immigrants come from much more conservative backgrounds than we do in our modern economies. There are a lot of people who have very traditional ideas about the family,
right.
About
role
their daughters, role
right.
of women, abortion, gay marriage.
Sure.
The European tendency is to sort of rub this in the immigrants' faces. I mean, the Dutch show them a video that shows men kissing and women bathing topless in the beach as a way to drive them away.
Because modern secular European culture is so libertine in a sense, or just live and let live.
That's right. And they tend to look at immigrants as backward. At the same time, immigrants don't have a road into mainstream European politics the way a conservative from Latin America who objects to abortion, say, would find his preoccupations reflected at the national level. So they make their own. They go back to Islam, they have their daughters wearing the veil, and that sort of thing.
All right, now what is the lesson from Europe for America and how to handle immigration, and especially Islamic immigration?
Well, there are certain things we have in common. One thing is that when you commit to immigration, you commit to immigration over the long term.
They're going to be here.
Yes, and they're going to be here in ever-increasing numbers because we talk about, immigrants doing the jobs that Americans won't do. Well, those immigrants, if things work out, are going to become Americans, and then they will no longer do the jobs that Americans won't do. Europeans are having a very hard time with that concept.
Do we do a better job than Europeans of assimilation? And
Absolutely.
Why is that?
In part, it's because we went through this before. We went through this 150 years ago. We are now a country of immigrants. They are not, and they're having a hard time adjusting to it. But there's another difference, which is when we became a country of immigrants, there were a lot of people examining where the United States was going, what was happening to the country. In Europe, there are so many taboos about talking about what's happening to Europe that they haven't had any real discussion, and they haven't been ordering it. And it's partly to break those taboos that I wrote this book.
But would you say that there is a real difference between, say, Mexican immigration, which is the dominant kind in the United States now, and Islamic immigration?
Mm-hmm.
Is there?
Yes, there is.
And would you put a limit on the latter?
Would I put? I'm not a European, so I have not suggested any.
But in the United States, would you limit it?
Again, I'm not a politician, but I do think that it will be more problematic for us to assimilate over the long term than Mexican immigration. The Mexicans come to communities that have religious institutions that they already belong to. They speak a European language. They speak a language that Americans learn in high school. It's much less of a gap.
All right, Chris Caldwell, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Paul.
We have to take one more break. When we come back, our hits and misses of the week.